So the first time I met Chuck was either 1995 or 96. I don't remember the exact date. But I was a detective with the Lewiston Police Department. And he was defense counsel. And we had this case where Chuck's client was accused of about 7 or 8 forgeries, had a bunch of stolen property. We went to the motel room that his client was staying in along with his client's significant other, and we recovered checkbooks, all these forged documents, all this stolen property. We brought it back, we arrested his client, and we were at a preliminary hearing. And I remember thinking in my arrogant police ways, what are we doing a preliminary hearing for? This guy is toast. We have all these documents, all this evidence. Why are we doing this hearing? And so Chuck is cross-examining me, and it was the first case I'd ever done with him. And they had excluded the witnesses, and I got through my testimony, and I'm thinking, that's it? That's all the great Chuck Kovis has? And at the very end of his cross, he looked at me and said, what did you do with the giant compressor with a wheel that was in the room? And I said, well, Mr. Kovis, I wheeled it out of the room, and it was too big and too heavy to get in a truck. So we were just down the station from the police department, so I wheeled it down to the police department, and we put it into the evidence room. And he turned and looked at me with one of those aha moments and said, that's not what the other detective said. He said you took it home. And he turned and walked away. And I remember thinking, this guy, what is he? No, Mr. Kovis, I didn't take it home. Withdrawn, Your Honor. And that was the end of the cross. And that was Chuck just teaching me a lesson.
My name's Tony Anagon. I'm from Lewiston, Idaho. And I've known Chuck Kovis since he started practicing law, because he started down in Lewiston. I tried one civil case with Chuck. Even though he did a lot of criminal defense, he did some work for Farmers Insurance. And we tried a case in Lewiston in the early 90s where his client and my client sued each other in a road rage situation. And the jury said they were both at fault and gave nobody any money. And so it ended up in a draw. And so that was my only trial, my whole civil practice that ended up in a draw. And Chuck Kovis was on the other side.
My name is Jay. My first trial was against Chuck Kovis. He scared the hell out of me, and I wasn't ready for trial as I wish I'd been, but nothing would have prepared me to really be ready for trial against Chuck Kovis. Partway through that trial, he was in the break room telling stories to the clerks, one of which someone asked him about the composition of the jury, and he mentioned that about 3 of the people on the 6-person jury were his neighbors. And I never really knew if that was true, or if he was just saying that knowing I was within earshot and he was going to screw with my head. In any event, the jury was out for about 15, 18 minutes, came back not guilty, and I had now had one trial under my belt against Chuck Kovis in which he had completely kicked my ass. And we continued to go back and forth for the next 3.5 years as opponents. He was always a formidable opponent. And he could be maddening, he could also be incredibly charming, and he really knew how to work a jury. I miss him, I learned a lot from him. I'll always be in his debt for getting me on this side of the aisle and encouraging me when I needed to be encouraged, and listening to me, and I listened to him. He was a smart man with a really big heart.
So I'm Sunil Ramalingam, and Chuck was like a big brother to me. I got a job in the prosecutor's office in Lewiston, and in my first 1.5 years or so, I had a jury trial against Chuck. Chuck had offered to plead his client to a misdemeanor. I had charged her with a felony. We ended up going to trial, and Chuck had told me, Sunil, if you don't take my offer and plead her guilty to this misdemeanor, you'll never lock her up. And I had told him, I'll take my chances with a jury. And I knew nothing about doing a jury trial. So we went to trial, and Chuck just kicked my ass. I was left sputtering and trying to come up with arguments, and I was pretty pissed about it for a while. And he was always great about it. Afterwards, I learned how much I had done wrong and how much he had done right. But he was always like a big brother to me. He always took time to tell me what I needed to do. When I started defending people instead of prosecuting them, he went out of his way to help me. He was one of the best people I ever knew. And I'll miss him, and I only hope that as I work with students at the law school, I can maybe pass on some of his passion, and maybe some of them will work like he did and carry on his legacy.
I'm Jeff Brody. I'm from Lewiston, and I knew Chuck because we hired Chuck when he was in law school to come to work in our law firm in Lewiston. One of my guiding principles for trying to teach new attorneys was to tell them to be a little bit more aggressive and that they could basically do anything in court that they wanted until somebody stopped them. I had imparted that advice to Chuck, and he'd gone over to court and done something a little bit beyond that. And he came back and told me what he got in trouble for, and I had to tell him that he couldn't do that.
My name's John Judge. I've known Chuck for over 30 years. Knew him as a lawyer, lawyers together. He has helped me a lot. I've learned a lot from him. He's a force of nature. Chuck had a capacity to connect with every person he ever came in contact with. He was one of the most open-minded, open-hearted people that I've ever met. He's a great lawyer, a great man, and we'll miss him. He was a great person. He's touched a lot of people's lives.
I don't know exactly when I met Chuck. I only had heard about him that he was winning a lot of trials in Lewiston, so I was intrigued. At some point we met, we became friends. He moved to Moscow. Our offices were next to each other. We tried cases together, but what a lot of folks don't know is we also tried a civil case together. This fellow who we represented had a shoulder injury. He had $275 worth of medical bills. Chuck, he developed such a relationship with that jury during voir dire that the rest of the trial was relatively easy. So I think the jury ended up awarding us $130,000. Chuck could do anything in a courtroom that he wanted to do, but he mainly wanted to keep us free.
I'm Kathy Mabbitt, and I knew Chuck from the courthouse and also from the Garden Lounge. And I was working as a nurse in the ER, and I got a call from the jail that they were bringing somebody down who'd been arrested for possession of meth, and it was up their rectum, and he wouldn't let them take it out. So between the jail, the 3 blocks from the jail to the ER, he shit it out and got it in his hand and bit into it. And then by the time he came to the ER, he was high. He was usually just a dealer and not a user, so he was very high. And he had shit all over his mouth. And the next day, Chuck Kovis got appointed to represent him. And I said, Chuck, I heard usually you just shake your client's hand, but this time you kissed him. You got appointed to shit eater. And so he did. And that's my favorite Chuck story.
I knew Chuck being an attorney myself, and also my daughter was a law school classmate of Chuck's. One of the times that I remember being impressed by Chuck was on a fishing trip up on the St. Joe River. I had learned to cook this salmon, a blackened salmon, and with this homemade tartar sauce, it just made a wonderful combination. And the impression, or what impressed me by Chuck was, I've never seen anyone eat so much salmon and tartar sauce at one time. He just loved it. He thought, boy, I've got to learn how to cook it that way, and give me a recipe of that tartar sauce.
I'm Lisa Morse, and I know Chuck because he's been kind of like my work dad for the last almost 16 years. I've worked for Tim all this time, and they've always shared a building, and Chuck has been there pretty much every day for me for the last 16 years. In about 2006, Tim told me to start keeping a list of the words that Chuck said. We called them Chuck's words. And there were words like, most people say binoculars, but Chuck said binoculars. And Chuck said Washington and testosterone and coccyx. And he was Chuck. There's a big hole that no one can fill now that he's gone, so.
My name is Megan Marshall, and I knew Chuck from having the pleasure of kicking him out of his office and taking over his office space. So I got to be hallmates with him for the last little under a year. I was helping him towards the end, helping him represent a client down in Lewis County, Nez Perce, Idaho, and I'd never been to Nez Perce before. And so Chuck, in his infinite wisdom, we decided we were going to take all the back roads to get there. Throughout that whole time, Chuck just continued to tell stories, and he had just the most incredible stories about growing up on the farm. And we talked about, what it was like to be on the farm and hard work. And he told me about the dairy cows. I told him about working on the farm with Dad. And we talked about rafting. We talked about fishing. And then he would tell me all these war stories about being a criminal defense attorney. And he never judged anyone. He was a people's man, and he could talk to anyone. He could talk to the richest or the poorest. He could talk to any race of people, any religion. You name it, whether they were criminals, whether they were drug addicts, whether they were the best people in the whole world, he could talk to them. And he made a point of getting to know everyone he came in contact with. And I can only hope that I will be able to do that. We miss you, we miss Chuck. Rest in peace, buddy.
In the last few years, Chuck was able to go on our Alaska fishing trip with us. And there would usually be 6 of us on the trip, and used to be people of various political persuasion. So my favorite recent Chuck story was that he would just like to cause a little trouble. We'd have a rather conservative member of the group and somebody that was a little more liberal, so Chuck, during the course of the trip on the raft, would just kind of throw out things like, how about gay marriage, and watch people argue about it. And he would just kind of sit back and smile and watch the arguments take place. And I got to see Chuck this August when we left on our trip to go to Alaska, and it was our hope that Chuck was going to be able to come back and go with us again next year, but that wasn't able to happen, and I'm certainly sorry about that.
Like everyone else has said, everyone loved Chuck. You just couldn't help it. And he could get away with saying the most inappropriate things. Like, he'd walk into the office after being at court, and he'd say, he'd always talk out of the side of his mouth, so he'd say, hey, I just saw so-and-so, and she wanted to have sex with me, but I told her no because I'm happily married. And that was Chuck, and he was always there with advice, and he was just kind of one of a kind.
My name is Jim Seavey, and Chuck and I had been pretty good friends, had done some fun stuff, and one time at the garden, when I had a Middle Fork salmon permit, I said, you want to do the Middle Fork? He says, fuck yes. So I threw him on my boat, we went down the Middle Fork, and of course, knowing Chuck like I did, I was a little concerned because my rafting friends weren't really conservative, but on the other hand, I don't know if they would really adjust to Chuck because he always called it whatever it was. Anyway, so we're on this rafting trip, and the first night we pull into the camp, and a good friend of mine from Red Lodge, who's a big miner with big muscles, and his wife is this real sweetheart with 4 teenage girls comes up and says, "What do you do?" He says, "Well, I'm a cho." "What's that?" "Chomo." "What's that mean?" "Child molester." "You got some kids?" Like, I'm going, fuck, they're gonna beat the shit out of this guy. But instead, like, oh man, by the end of the night, we're drinking homemade booze this friend of mine, Ernie's, made, and everybody loves Chuck. So we do this trip, and we're going down the river, and among other things, one night Chuck says to me, "I never knew that grown-ups could have this much fun."
Right about this time of the year, Thanksgiving is coming up, and I ran into Chuck at the garden, where the local watering hole, and he asked me, "Hey Alvin, what do you got planned for the holidays?" And I told him I wanted to take a 30-day Amtrak train back to Minnesota, where I originate, but I just couldn't swing. You know, I looked it up, and it was $574 or something of that. And I told him, I can't. I'll be right here. And he said, "Well, what do you need? What up?" And I said, "Well, I can't go and borrow $600. And he said, "Hey, stop over to the office tomorrow afternoon. I'll be there." So it was maybe a Thursday afternoon, and I stopped by his office, and he said, "Alvin, hey, here, come on in here." And he slid a check across the desk made out to me for $600. And I told him, I said, no, here. You know, have a good holiday. And I said, "Write loan on the memo, because I will pay you back." Well, about 4 or 5 months later, I got back ahead of things. I think I got my tax return back, and I was going to start paying him back. And I saw him at the garden, and I handed him $2.20, and he said, No. You can buy me a beer, but what part of gift didn't you understand?
I'll start by saying Tim went into Chuck's office and found he had all these clients he represented essentially for free, and they were not Chuck. I know. He was not in this for the money, but they would give him a bottle of scotch. And so Tim found these bottles of scotch, and so I'm serving their small taste, but there's plenty more to drink in other areas. So can I give each of you a little bit of liquid freedom?
My name is Monique Lillard. I teach at the College of Law. Chuck was in my class a long time ago. I actually don't remember that very well. I remember him as a lawyer. I remember when I was called to jury duty and it was his case, and he said the prosecution got me out right away because they were afraid I'd actually apply the law. But the story I really remember about Chuck is he was telling me about representing someone who was in drug court. And everybody's supposed to be working together. Everybody's supposed to be telling the truth about everything. But then the client said to Chuck privately, "Well, should I tell him I was using last night?" And Chuck said, "No, and don't tell me." But then Chuck just looked back and he said, "When push comes to shove, I'm going to pick my client. I'm going to advocate for my client. I'm not going to walk in there and rat my client out." So it always strikes me as the quintessential lawyer approach. The thing to do. So we will miss him. Take care.
One night we were at the garden, as we often were, and we were talking to the lawyer who had taken Chuck's contract when the commissioners here had the bad judgment to let him go. And we were sitting down, and she said something like, "Well, it's like so-and-so said, the client is the enemy." And Chuck and I looked at each other and didn't say anything, but when she was gone, he said, "Did she say that?" And I said, "Did you hear that?" And we talked about it. And the thing about Chuck was, it didn't matter who his client was. He was there to serve the client. He believed in his client, and he knew his duty was to the client. And those were words that would never have come out of his mouth. And he broke his ass working for all kinds of people, but he knew his duty was to them. And that's why we were here, and that's what he passed on to me, and he passed it on to anyone who ever worked with him.
My name is Amanda Montalvo. I started working for Chuck in 2010. In the time that I knew Chuck, he was very helpful and a very bright person to be around. I was a prosecuting attorney at the time, or at least an intern at the law school, and he snatched me up as soon as my time with the internship was up. He taught me how to defend people. He taught me to seek justice. He introduced me to a lot of parts of Idaho and all of the things that it had to offer. We would travel to different counties to defend people, as he had the contract in, I'd say, about 3 or 4 counties, and we would drive all around town, and he knew the best places to pick fruit, and he knew people and their names and their stories, and always had great things to share. He was a wonderful person and somebody that I looked up to as a mentor, a teacher, a defense attorney, and almost a father. He helped me through a lot of very difficult times, and he was very gracious with his time and energy. He helped me get through law school. He helped me when I was studying for the bar, and I continue to channel his energy in everything that I do, as I continue to fight for the defenseless and the indigent. He will forever be memorialized in the work that I'm able to do.
I'm Sarah Nelson, and I'm Tim Gressback's wife, and I have a lot of Chuck stories, but the one I want to tell is about the trip that our families took together down to Mexico for the Christmas and New Year's holidays. I think it was 2004 to 2005. What I love about Chuck is that he's just curious about everything, and he wants to connect with people. We drove all the way down from Moscow to northern Mexico, stopping in Winnemucca and Vegas on the way. Chuck and I were trying to brush up on a little Spanish, and we would put on the like Spanish language tapes and try things out and everything until everybody else in the car said, like, stop that. But he just kept on trying to use his Spanish, and so the rest of us in Mexico, we just kind of hung out at this nice house that belonged to friends of Tim's. Every day, Chuck got up and went down into the village and took the public transit bus that brought him to Guaymas, to the town of Guaymas. And he just walked around and spent the day in Guaymas, and then he came home and told us about it. And then towards the end of our trip, one day, Tim and Luke and I decided to follow him to Guaymas. And so we got on the bus with him and went in, and we got off in the center of town and started walking into the covered market that was in the center of town. And as soon as we got in, there were all these vendors at the different stands. They're like, "Hey, hola, Chuck! Chuck, hola!" And we walked around and met all the people that he had gotten to know over this last week to 10 days. And across the street, there was a shoe store, a chain shoe store that was called Tres Hermanos. And so we're just standing there, and Chuck looks at these 2 high school girls standing next to him, and he goes, Tres Hermanos y dos hermanas. And the photo of the picture has these 2 girls going. But I mean, that's who Chuck was. He just tried it out and just connected with people, and that's why I just love Chuck.
So my name is Erin Tomlin, and when I went to law school, I was a little bit of a misfit. I had a dog named Gideon, for Gideon versus Wainwright, and I just wanted to work for the best public defender, and I heard his name was Chuck Kovis. But he didn't answer his phone, and he was always at court, and I just needed him to hire me, but I couldn't find him. I just wanted to talk to him. I think I knew I wanted to be a part of that greatness before I met him. And so I heard a rumor that he liked to work on Sundays when the phones didn't ring, and that he always looked out the window of his second floor office. So I was driving to Winco. I was going grocery shopping on a Sunday in my sweats, scrubbed out, and I drove by that office on Washington Street, and I parked right outside, and I started yelling at the window. And he told me to come back and talk to him about a job. And he was there the next time I came back. And he had a big filing cabinet that said rafting or river trips or something like that. And so that's what we talked about. And we talked about what I wanted to do a little tiny bit, but mostly we just talked as two people would who were becoming friends. And he asked me what I'd done on the river and where I'd lived, and we talked about the little small towns in Idaho that made me who I was, and he hired me. And then I needed Chuck's blessing for anything I did after that. When I became a prosecutor, I asked him if I could become one and if he would be okay with it. And then when I was one, he still taught me how to do my job. And I remember working with him and all of the public defender clients, and I loved it so much. And he looked at me one day and he said, "This is fun, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, this is so fun." I don't know how to go to court every day and not have him texting me, making jokes about what's going on. I don't know how to walk in the garden and not want him to be there to share a drink with. And I'm just so profoundly grateful for him. And I think he would tell me to buck up and fight the good fight and keep going. And so that's what I'm going to do.